Welcome to Are You Chemistry GCSE Ready? This playlist takes you through loads of example questions and guided solutions for every single topic in your chemistry GCSE. So it's a perfect way for you to test your chemistry knowledge. If you feel like you need a quick review or you just want the ideal revision companion for these videos, then make sure to download my free chemistry GCSE revision notes. I've linked them in the description below. Or if you're ready, let's dive straight in.
Okay, let's do some questions about making salts. So what kind of reactions can we use to make salts? So from the previous work that we've done, you should be aware that we could use a neutralization reaction. So that is when we take an acid and a base and we end up with water and a salt. Okay, so that kind of reaction always makes a salt. Or again, from previous work, if we have a metal and an acid, and remember our mnemonic MASH, what we get there, metal and acid, gives us salts, and also H there is for hydrogen. And these two reactions, they can make soluble salts or insoluble salts. It really just depends what you're using. And the final one is your precipitation reaction, which is the one that's been introduced in this topic. And that's how you get insoluble salts forming. So the method that we end up using to make these salts and then to separate them out as well really depends on a few things. It depends on if the salt that we're making is soluble and insoluble, but it also actually depends on the things that we are using to make that salt, the reactants themselves as well. So we'll go through some of those a little bit later. Right. When we want a pure dry sample of salt, what do we need to keep in mind? So let's deal with those two words separately because they're quite distinct. So when we're talking about pure, we mean how are we going to separate that salt from everything else and make sure it's a pure substance. And you're going to use some kind of separating technique that you would have learned from topic 10 and keep states of matter in mind here. Yeah, so for example, if you have made an insoluble salt, the technique that you use to separate that, because it is a solid and is most likely therefore in a liquid, you could, for example, filter it. But if you've made a soluble salt, then you might need to evaporate the liquid that it is in to leave the salt behind. Okay, so it depends on the circumstance. And then to make it dry, a dry sample of salt, either, again, if it was an insoluble salt that you'd filtered off, you might use a bit of filter paper to dry it, or a low temperature oven. If you were using crystallization, then you might have to leave the evaporating basin somewhere and wait for the water to fully evaporate to form those crystals, for example.
Titration. So how do we use a titration to make salt? Well, we are using this process method when your salt is soluble, but also when your acid and base are also soluble. Okay, so we can't use the excess solid method because the base is soluble as well. And so remember, what you need is you need an indicator in this experiment so that you can initially work out what is your balance of how much acid and alkali you need so that you get this complete reaction, and it needs to be a complete reaction so that your final salt is therefore pure. So you do need an indicator in the first instance to be able to work out what that balance was. You've got your alkali in your conical flask, you're adding your acid to it when that indicator changes colour. That tells you that you've had this complete neutralization reaction. We leave the indicator out of the final repeat though, so that the salt at the end is pure. So once you've done that a few times and you've got some concordant results of how much titer or acid you needed to add to your alkali so that you had this neutralization reaction, on your final go, you need to put the right amount of acid in as you've worked out from your previous experiments, but leave the indicator out, otherwise your salt won't be pure.
So let's do some decision making here. How do we select the correct process to make the correct salt out of the correct reactants? So how do we make the following? Copper sulfate from copper oxide. So this requires you to have learnt that table in your notes and to know the following, that your copper sulfate that you're trying to make is a soluble salt, and that your copper oxide that you are trying to make this copper sulfate from is insoluble, and that is your base. So since that's insoluble, you use your excess and your filter technique. And really just go back to the notes and learn all of these different experimental techniques off by heart. Next one then, your potassium nitrate from potassium hydroxide and nitric acid. Well, the potassium nitrate itself is soluble, and your potassium hydroxide, and that's the thing you're using as your base, is soluble as well. So that's when you're going to use your titration method that we just went through on the previous slide. And how about finding lead chloride from lead nitrate and sodium chloride? Well, lead chloride is an insoluble salt that you are trying to make, and therefore you use the one technique that you have in your notes, which is this precipitation reaction from these other two soluble salts.
Just before we go into the tips and tricks section, if you do want some extra advice to getting that grade 9 for your GCSE, then why not download my free 20-minute exam success guide? Just click on the link in the description below. I'm going to give away all of my best advice and secrets, and completely for free, so why not?
Tips and tricks of this section. First one is basically, if you're going to know some things well to help you here, learn your separating techniques, learn your different acid reactions, and that actually makes this topic and selecting the process of how to make the salt much easier, and also therefore remembering the whole technique off by heart much easier if you're very confident with those. Make sure you remember to dry your crystals, and it's a common point that occurs across all of the different techniques, but the way that you leave them to dry can vary. Okay, so have you made an insoluble salt and you're drying it with filter paper and leaving it in low temperature oven, or have you made it as a soluble salt and therefore you're having to evaporate that water and leave the salt to crystallize?